In this first video of lesson 2, let's try to get into Saul's head about what happened on the road to Damascus. I think we can all agree, along with Saul, that something cataclysmic happened. And we often say that Saul did a complete 180, immediately turning into Paul the apostle. And he absolutely changed direction and focus. But the term conversion is debated. In some ways, Paul is radically different, but in many ways, he is the same Saul. Conversion for us implies leaving one religion for another, and this isn't at all what happened to Paul. Some prefer to call it a call. Now, we don't need to quibble about words, but noting the similarities and differences is worthwhile. Saul the Pharisee, worshiper of the one true God, steeped in Jewish tradition and scripture, extremely zealous to the point of violence in preserving the purity of those Jewish traditions, is on a mission to destroy the church in Damascus. Now, why Damascus? Well, because it's a major trade hub, and if this movement succeeds in Damascus, if this heretical teaching spreads along those trade routes, the whole Jewish identity centered around temple and Torah might very well be at risk. And after his encounter, Paul still worships the one true God. He has not left Judaism or turned away from the Hebrew scriptures at all, but he understands them in a completely new way. So, like Saul, let's think about stories in the Hebrew scriptures. Let's look back. What stories involve a bright light and a voice? Well, in Exodus, we remember that a voice speaks to Moses from a burning, flaming bush. Now, also, Ezekiel has a very strange vision that turns out to be a vision of God's throne. It starts at the base of the throne with flashing lightning and brilliant light and fire like glowing metal. And then later in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 28 to 25, a voice comes from atop this throne, from a man who looks like fire or like a rainbow with radiance all around him. It's like this or like that, but really indescribable. Another story is when Daniel sees and hears a voice of a man whose face is like lightning, whose eyes are like torches, and whose limbs are like burnished bronze, which is when bronze turns white from the heat of the fire. Bright, white light, and a voice. Saul the Pharisee knows that a voice coming from the heavens and a bright light is God. The big word for this is theophany, which means a visible manifestation of God to a human. Indescribable. Then the voice himself describes and identifies himself as the very much alive, crucified, dead, yet resurrected Jesus. Saul thinks, the resurrection will happen at the end of time, when God returns to restore his creation, to set all things back to the way he intended. This can't be happening. Everyone is supposed to resurrect at the same time, at the end of time. But if it is happening, if Jesus is resurrected, it can only mean one thing. Jesus is God's chosen Messiah. The fact that God powerfully resurrected Jesus proves this. And this resurrected Jesus just spoke to Paul in the same way, the very same way that all Jews know that God speaks to human through bright light. Now, we can't say that Paul understands at this very moment that Jesus is God in the flesh, as we believe, but he certainly sees Jesus as God's promised Messiah, as the fulfillment of God's promises. God has come. He has launched his kingdom and begun the process of making all things right. As Paul later explains to Festus and Agrippa, this is the Jewish hope. He is on trial because of this Jewish hope, that he believes Jesus fulfills the Jewish hope, that God has unexpectedly kept his promises to the Jews in this one man, Jesus. The end of time has begun. Now, let's think and imagine for a moment what Paul is doing over those 3 days before Ananias shows up. Beyond fasting and praying, we know he has a vision that a man named Ananias will come and place his hands on him and restore his sight. I imagine that must have been reassuring for him and allowed him to put aside any fear of being blind forever and to begin the process of understanding his experience. We don't know anything about his host, but we can guess that Paul had to explain his blindness and then his experience. And perhaps the two of them processed the encounter together. Paul is certainly going over in his mind, rehearsing the scriptures he has memorized and recited over and over, trying to make sense of this encounter with a living Jesus. Paul is connecting the dots. He is piecing together all the prophecies he knows so well, and maybe some that he didn't understand until now. He begins to see how it might make sense, just opening up the possibility that his expectations, that all of the Jewish expectations were off target, just a bit, not wrong, but off target, all because of this undeniable encounter with Jesus. So Paul, the apostle, is born. And that terminology, being born or being reborn or becoming new creation, this terminology will become a huge part of Paul's message. The old is gone, dead and crucified, and a new person has emerged. And this is powerfully symbolized in baptism, that is immersion, when a person is submerged in the water, symbolizing that they die to their old life and then they rise from the water, reborn, born of the Spirit. This makes sense to Paul too, because in addition to bringing justice and peace, God making all things right means restoring creation to the way he intended. And this means restoring humans to their pre-fall state, restoring humans to be in God's image. That means humans in their current state, in their sinful state, need to die and be reborn or recreated as part of what God is doing in end times.